My experience with the Xenoblade Chronicles series has been a bit of a roller coaster. I absolutely adore the first game. Its wonderful cast of beautifully written characters and its stunning vistas captivate me every time I play it. Walking out of Tephra Cave to see the Mechonis looming in the horizon, there just isn't anything quite like it. Then there is the second game, and well, I have a video on it going over my overall thoughts. Let's just say I am quite critical of many of the story beats and design decisions in the game. Despite that, it didn't stop me from getting excited for the third installment. Just the box art alone, showcasing aspects of both worlds, it instantly hooked me in. Oh, the possibilities of smashing these two worlds together were endless. Even though it came out mid-2022, I didn't get to play it until earlier this year, and, well, this game is weird. If you couldn't tell by the title of this video, I stand somewhat in the middle on the quality of the game. I think the game has equal amounts of amazing and awful parts to it. The game is a mashup of the first two, not just in world, but in seemingly quality as well. It's weird. Right off the bat, the opening of this game blew me away. The two worlds of Bionis and Alrest have merged into a new world, Ionios. The world is one of constant war. The two factions of Keves and Agnes, with people and architecture from their respective games, are in a never-ending struggle for life itself. The people of these nations are all soldiers, and are forced to fight the other in order to take their life forces for sustenance, for the very right to live. Those that die leave behind a seemingly calcified husk, immortalizing their last potentially horrifying moment. But the dead may very well be the ones that have it easy, as the living will continue to battle, continue to lose the only other people they have in this nightmare of a world. This is how the game opens. Holy shit. This is really dark, and it only gets more dark the more you think about it. And I fucking love it. This kind of setting can be used to explore some seriously deep themes and create powerful character moments. I wasn't expecting for a second that they would have the gall to go this route, especially when it's a Nintendo product at the end of the day. I was immediately drawn to the main Kevesi cast of characters. Noah, Lance, and Uni have fantastic chemistry. They bounce off of each other in such a natural way, and you can tell that they have been partners in this war for quite a while. At the same time, we are naturally given tutorials for the combat and systems of the game, and the way the game handles tutorials is absolutely infuriating. It's hard to describe, as I don't want to call it hand-holding, because it's even worse than that. The first thing we are given is a tutorial on auto-attacks. Fucking auto-attacks. Not just a note that says your character automatically attacks, but it makes you sit there for several enemies just auto-attacking. Why? Who needed this? Hilariously, the tutorial has a big reminder that says don't forget to auto-attack. Except, that's the whole point of auto-attacks. They're automatic. I don't need to think about it. At least the combat section ends quickly enough, but the menu tutorials go on throughout the game, and they are absolutely baffling. Every time the game wants you to check something out in the menu, it makes you go through every single button press individually. I am not exaggerating. Enter the menu, get a pop-up. Go to the right menu, get a pop-up. It literally forces you to confirm every single step, and it's infuriating. How dumb do they think we are that we need to be guided through a menu this hard? Especially when I got a tutorial for equipping items. Twice!
Oh, come on!
The second game is pretty infamous for horrific tutorials where sometimes they would just give straight up false information. This game went way too far in the opposite direction, essentially having the ultimate form of handholding. It's a menu. Let's give people more credit than this. The developers may have wanted to avoid the issues that happened in the previous title, but I have another theory. Padding. Perhaps one person out there never played a video game before and needed to be told how to work a menu, but for the rest of us, all this does is waste time. So much time is wasted through this game, even outside of the tutorials. That's what pushes me to believe the developers were padding for time, trying to extend the playtime of the game. Let me explain. Once the combat tutorial ends, we get a flashback. We see Noah, Uni, and Lance when they were younger. The flashback shows that people are born from pods as children. No mothers, fathers, family, they are created and thrust into this cruel world. Immediately, these kids begin training to become soldiers. This is all sorts of fucked up, and once again, I love the premise of this world and getting the chance to explore such intense concepts. We meet their friend Yorin, who isn't in the present day. Lance gets into a fight with him over a mock battle they lost. It's a way to set up some character for Lance. We can guess that since Yorin isn't there anymore, that something happened. They then see a homecoming, a special event held for those that can survive until their 10th term or year. They are supposedly returned to the Queen from which they were quote-unquote born after their 10th year, and this is held as a very honorable accomplishment that most want to achieve. It's also a good way of showing the culture of the people of this world. They still have customs in their strict society. So this flashback actually accomplishes a handful of things. That's pretty good, right? Well, the thing is, this cutscene also lasts like 7 minutes or so. What it accomplishes is good, but why did it take so long to do it? It could have been condensed. A large portion of the runtime of the cutscene is the mock battle, which the battle itself isn't really necessary. Nothing is really gained outside of Yorin's personality and shortcomings, which could have easily been established and fleshed out in the conversation afterwards. The whole thing ends up taking way more time than was needed and could have been done far more efficiently.
Maxing every single second!
This is what pushes me towards the padding argument. One may have the initial response of saying, "Come on man, it's only 7 minutes, why are you complaining?" And that would be fair if it didn't take place through the entire game. It's commonly seen in the flashbacks because there are a metric fuck ton of flashbacks in this game. This game is addicted to flashbacks, and often the same flashback is played ad nauseum. As it's hinted at, Yorin is killed when there is an enemy attack on their base. But the part where Yorin is about to be crushed by rubble is played like 1.5 million times through the game. Anytime people have the tiniest thought about the moment, well, time to play the flashback. After 80 hours, it's like, alright game, I fucking get it. Oh, something reminded me of something. Might as well flash back to it for a hot second. God forbid we give people credit in understanding the events of the game, let's just shove it in their face. Because what is subtlety? It doesn't seem like much at first, but after a while, these things really start to add up. Flashbacks are also a bit of a strange way to tell a story, is it not? Flashbacks can be useful in situations, but they are usually used to tell or show specific bits, not large swaths of the story. Like at the start, with the flashback to when they were kids. This informs us more about the world, and that even as children they are taught to fight. That is a useful way to use a flashback, and it's early on in the game, so it's prime time to get that information to players. But the same scene is also used to then give us an argument between Lance and Yorin that will serve as a source of his character traits. Why are his base character traits being told to us like this? I want to see the current Lance. I want to see how these things affect him, or how he has dealt with the events of his life in the current day. I didn't need a flashback to learn about his grief, or that he blames himself for what happens. Not shortly after the initial tutorial battle, the group are bathing, and Noah remarks how Lance pushes himself too hard. This one line can inform us a lot about Lance as character. He pushes himself, so likely he feels as if he needs to make up for his mistakes of the past, and his attempts to prevent them from happening again. The way Lance acts, and his conversation with his team members, should be more than enough to get this across to the player. So it's strange to me that it's being retroactively told in a way, and it's not just Lance. Toward the end of the first chapter, a huge battle between Kevis and Agnes is taking place. They are fighting over the ability to fight a third mysterious force. Noah and his team encounter another team from Agnes, Mio, Senna, and Tyon, and they battle to a standstill. A strange man by the name of Van Damme interrupts the fight and questions their motives. Before long, he is attacked by a huge monster, a Mobius. Van Damme, in a last-ditch effort, activates an artifact and bestows strange powers to the 6 of them, allowing them to fend off the strange monster. The artifact linked all of them together, making them Ouroboros, and in doing so freed them from their flame clocks, the machines that tied them to the endless conflict, but at the cost of making their former colonies hostile. This is the inciting incident that puts the group on their journey. Former enemies are now thrust together and must put aside their differences to unlock the mysteries of the world and find out why it is the way it is. Once again, I like this setup and premise. The foundations of the story are deep, in that the nature of this world will likely put characters in very intense, traumatic, and emotional situations throughout their lives. These two factions are raised from children to despise one another and do nothing but fight the other for the right to live at all. So when we force them together, it is a perfect jumping off point for some interesting and heated discussions. However, there is a big problem with how the game approaches it. The issue is that we have spent the entire first chapter with our Kavesi characters. We have focused in on them and their perspective. Now, suddenly, we have 3 brand new characters that we need to make up for the lost time on their characterization. That is where those pesky flashbacks come into play. Instead of us getting their histories and character traits through discussion or interaction, we are given flashbacks periodically, depending on when the game wants us to know the details. For example, when the group arrive at the Orion Mountains near a colony that Taion was stationed at in the past, it's like the game decided, okay, it's time to talk about him. It's really obvious where these points happen too. Taion notices a colorful tree that a commanding officer he knew, Nimue, was fond of. When he stops to look at it, it's such a clear way of the game saying, it's time to talk about Taion. So we will end up, of course, getting a good old flashback to when he was stationed at the colony. It fully explains how he was peer pressured into a decision he didn't want to make, and it got people killed, including Nimue, who he respected greatly. Obviously, this does weigh on him, and it's all thrown to the front in this part of the game. But why is it presented through flashbacks? Why are we seeing it from the past and not the present day Taion? Why can't I see how this affected him through the way he speaks and presents himself? Right after the group initially set off on their journey, they are discussing their options on the pathways they can take. Taion recommends for a riskier path near an Agnes colony, while Mio pushes back saying it's not safe enough. Taion's reasoning is that it's faster, but also that Mia hates the heat of the desert. What a massive missed opportunity, though. Taion should have been the one to push the safer option, almost to a fault. He could have been very stern in his analysis of the situation, even creating some friction between him and the Kavesi members of the team. It would have been a great chance to inform us of how his past has affected him, and how it informs the decisions he makes now while also creating interactivity within the group. But instead, the information is just thrown into a flashback later on. It could have been so much better. Another example is actually after this conversation they were having, they run into Colony 4. The colony is led by Ethel, a woman who saved Noah in the attack that killed Yorn. We find out they met her, and how do we find this out? You guessed it, through a flashback. If you have a conversation telling the Acneans about Ethel and how she saved them, it could have been a perfect chance for the group to bond. They could find out about Yorn's death, how they have lost from a very early point in their lives, and maybe helping them understand each other despite their teams being the ones to cause each other's losses. All while informing us of Ethel's strength and importance in the story. Why do that when we could just have a flashback instead? I think the worst moment of this is when it's Senna's turn in the spotlight. I really like Senna as a character, but holy shit, her story arc is so abrupt and out of left field. Much later in the game, the group infiltrated the Kavesi castle, and a ton of stuff happens here. I won't break it all down, but we learn about Mobius, the way new soldiers are born, the Kavesi queen, and basically it's got very little to do with Senna herself. But after the team escape, out of nowhere, Senna starts doubting herself and asks if she was good enough. Bam! We get a flashback for her, and it's got nothing to do with anything that just happened.
Well, fucking why?
The game just hard cuts focus to her. Like, where the fuck did this come from? The developer's reliance on flashbacks, I feel, hinders the potential storytelling greatly. They could have had so much more, but copped out by having constant scenes that just directly throw the message or theme in your face. Keep in mind, I am not criticizing the content itself, but rather the presentation and construction. I feel the game does a terrible job at presenting information in an effective or efficient manner. The first chapter is a great example. As I mentioned, it's focused entirely on the Kavesi side of the group. While the dynamic between the three is nice, we don't get anything for the Agnian side of the cast for the entire chapter. Unlike the previous two games, with a lot of story chapters, this game has only 7, but they are elongated. The entirety of Chapter 1 is about tutorials and getting the ball rolling, but it takes fucking forever to get there. It can easily take a few hours just to get to the second chapter, so there is a lot of time that we just don't get with the other half of the cast. I feel like the game would have an easier time with character development if this first chapter was actually reversed. It should have started with a more general setting inside of Colony 9. The characters could have been prepping for the big battle, and we could still get a lot of the same stuff that's already there. But then, instead of going to that big battle, since the team are considered special forces, they get diverted to a different task. This would allow them to meet up with Mio, Senna, and Taion significantly faster. Being put together as a team faster is important to allow the group dynamic to form. Not that it doesn't, but they have to make it happen much faster, and it can somewhat be a little too fast at times. In the way it is, Chapter 2 is when these characters finally get together, and they should have great disdain for each other, or at least a massive amount of tension. There is some tension between Taion and Lance, but why do the other four just give in to things so easily? Noah is shown to question things before they are freed, but not Uni, so why does she just accept things so fast? It's hard to say much about Mio or Senna, because at this point they have only just been introduced, so their character traits are less known. It ends up being mostly Lance and Taion having a little bit of stubbornness and back and forth, but even that ends fairly quickly. By the time we get to Colony 4, the group don't really have any friction at all. With how much they are trying to do in a short time, it kinda has to be that way because we just don't have enough time to get the ball rolling. I don't think that their character dynamics are bad, but just rushed and not as fleshed out as they could have been. With the cast being thrown together all at once, it means there was that much more work to do. If we look at the previous two games, both take a more elongated approach to building the party. You meet party members one at a time, and build up the group over time. What this means is that they can flesh out their relationship before adding more on top of it. For example, in the first game, there is some interaction with Dunban, but a lot of the focus is on Shulk and Rhine. Their relationship and dynamic are built up all throughout the events of Colony 9, Tefra Cave, and part of Gar Plains. Their interactions tell us a lot about them as characters and their history together. It's given room to breathe before then adding Charlotte into the mix. It gives a strong foundation to build on when time is given to allow characters to grow together. In this game though, the 6 team members are thrust together very quickly, and it forces the developers to rush their relationship much faster than they should have. Another reason why I talked so heavily about the flashbacks and this presentation of the story is because I feel it adds to the padding of the game runtime. Shoving massive amounts of cutscenes everywhere, be it a flashback or a general cutscene that just has unnecessary fluff, as I talked about earlier, makes it take up a massive amount of time. Later in the game, at the end of Chapter 5, a huge boss fight occurs. This fight is against Mobius N and M. It starts with a generic fight against some enemies, into a fight with M, a second fight with M, and a final fight with N. Meanwhile, between every battle is a giant amount of plot. There is so much happening in this one sequence that it took me over 50 minutes to get through all of it, and I was even over-leveled for the boss fights. Why in the fuck does this last nearly an hour? How could this sequence require this much time? There is no way this couldn't have been cut down to a more manageable level. Perhaps removing the repeated boss fight for starters? It's made worse when after the fight, there is nearly 30 minutes of cutscene where the group are imprisoned, followed up by a series of cutscenes that you see by slowly walking through clouds, which lasts another 20 minutes or so. Of course, it doesn't end there, because after all of that, you get another 2 boss fights, including a repeated fight with N. Holy mother of mercy, this is ridiculous. It's like 2 hours before you get back to the regular game. How did it end up like this? It's incredibly excessive and unbelievably inefficient. Not only are boss fights repeated, but they drag out the cutscenes with stuff that could have been told in a quicker and simpler manner. For example, during the fight with M, her power is to briefly mind control people. They spend so much time of the cutscene having the group hitting each other when we only needed like 2 examples to see how dangerous it was. Instead, we see the group flailing around forever, trying to figure out what to do. It's just wasting time. When it gets to the point where it takes nearly an hour to get through this single sequence, I really start to think it's being done on purpose to pad the runtime, to make the game feel bigger than it really is. How about when the group are on a path after they visit Colony Lambda, and on their travels they find a fucking dragon? No joke, just on this path, randomly, there is a damn dragon that is just sitting there waiting for us. What the fuck? After you beat the dragon, the team has a conversation about their Ouroboros powers. Oh, I see. You threw a dragon at me just to stop and have a cutscene. Just to have the characters randomly discuss this out of nowhere. I wonder if this topic is going to be relevant soon. It's so forced. Like, come on, game. You could have had the characters discuss this far more naturally than throwing a random fucking dragon at me.
It's just dumb.
It's not all bad, though. Much of the premise of this world creates a handful of fascinating themes to explore, such as time. Soldiers of Kevis and Agnes are given a strict lifespan of only 10 years. They all have a marker somewhere on their body that slowly fades away, and once it does, they will have achieved their homecoming. Although, living a full 10 years is not an easy feat considering the nature of this world. This makes time a very precious commodity. It's all at the backdrop of a ticking clock. Perhaps the flame clocks are a bit too on the nose, but it symbolizes that everlasting struggle for more opportunities, more time, more precious life to have. We more directly explore this theme through Mio, who when we meet her is only 4 months away from her homecoming. After becoming Ouroboros, the group are freed from their flame clocks and no longer need to fight for others' life forces. While this freedom is great, it doesn't remove their marks, and they are still on a ticking clock. Through the course of the game, we discover that everything the soldiers are taught is a lie. The war between Kevis and Agnes is completely fabricated and controlled by the faction of Mobius. These strange people pull the strings from behind the scenes to encourage and prolong the war indefinitely. The truth is shocking to everyone, but for Mio, it brings with it the weight of her actions through her life and her overall mortality. Everything she fought for, everything she lost, it was all for a lie. Now she only has a few months left. Will she be able to make the proper use of that time? Will she be able to really make a difference and leave a lasting impact? I think this is something that many can relate to, or at least understand. We all want to have a purpose in our lives, and feel like there is meaning in our actions. There is a scene in Colony 4 where Mio is alone in a tent. She is looking at her mark, and clearly struggling with the notion that she is going to die very soon. But when Senna comes into the room, she tried to hide her true feelings. She doesn't want to burden her friends, but at the same time has such a weight and burden on her shoulders. How tough it must be to see that mark whittle away, day after day, knowing there is nothing you can do to prevent it from happening. Mio's goal is to make best use of the time she has left, but there are others that have the opposite approach. Mobius are the very clear villains, that use soldiers and the war as a way to consume life energy and grow in power. However, the biggest goal of Mobius is to continue the endless now. The two worlds of Bionis and Allrest have seemingly fused, but not really. We learned in the second game that a scientist by the name of Klaus performed an experiment that went wrong, splitting himself and the world in two. The remnants of his world would become Allrest, while the new world would be the Bionis. These two worlds were made from the same materials, and thus yearned to reconjoin. This process would destroy both worlds if it occurred, but the people of these worlds came up with a failsafe. They managed to communicate and build two halves of a massive machine called Origin. Each world had one half, and it stored all of the information of their worlds, down to the very souls of the inhabitants. When the worlds collided, Origin would also be put together, and it would recreate everything to as it was. But when the moment came, it did not happen the way that they had hoped. Instead, the Mobius seized control of Origin and froze time in place. Their leader Zed perpetuated the endless now, a moment frozen in time that would never cease. Zed was manifested from the fears of all the souls inside Origin, the fear that the world would really end. So they created a world that would never end, and endless now. Zed is literally a manifestation of fear, fear of the future. The future is scary. Who knows what might come our way? Whether it be procrastination or distractions, we often try to find ways to avoid that future. It's much easier to be in the present, where you know what's happening, where you can feel more comfortable and safer. Zed pushes that idea to the max, making a world where people endlessly fight each other for the very right to live at all. That way, people are always focused on the present, always focused on the now, no matter what. The lengths people will go to avoid the future, to make their lives have meaning, or to just deal with what's to come. I think it's a fascinating theme to explore. Mobius N is probably the forefront of this theme though. Spoiler, he's Noah. I know, shocking. The guy that looks just like Noah had a covering over his eyes, so who would have thought? Jokes aside, he is an alternative version of Noah that chose to become Mobius. Since Zed has access to the information of people's literal souls, they can recreate people an endless number of times. When somebody they created dies, they can have them reborn as a child once again. This means there is never a shortage of soldiers, and Mobius can mess with the two factions as much as they'd like with little repercussion. Noah, in his past cycles of rebirth, has regularly fought against Zed and his Mobius. Every life he finds and falls in love with Mio, and every life watches her die after they lose to Zed. Until one cycle, Noah decided to run away with Mio, and they had a child together. Due to their marks, they still both eventually pass at their 10th year. This is the breaking point for him, and is offered a choice by Zed. He would never have to lose Mio again, never have to fail again, and all he has to do is become Mobius. In his grief, he takes that offer, even against Mio's wishes. He commits terrible acts upon former allies, and perpetuates the endless now. But instead of fear of what's to come, he does this because of the past, out of grief and despair. He acts to prevent that pain from happening again. It's a fascinating look into how people deal with the pain of loss. N is sort of a direct representation of holding on to something too tightly, being so afraid of losing what you have in the moment that he can't move on. Being unable to forgive himself, he will forever be stuck in the present, in the endless now, until he can learn to take that first step, past the seemingly endless pit of sorrow. I feel these themes are explored quite well in game. We see their struggles, we understand their points of view and motivations, and it gives us many things to consider. But I struggle with how we get there. What matters most is the journey, not the destination. So while I love these themes, how we get to them is flawed. Take Zed for example. We learn all about him and how he came to be in chapter 6. Like, nearly the end of the game. The villain, the big bad, the guy behind all of it. We know virtually nothing about him for 85% of the game. After so much time, dozens upon dozens of hours of gameplay, we just have no idea who this guy is. Motivations, history, nothing. We get these random cutscenes with Mobius in a theater, and it's just like, what the fuck is any of this? It's not just who they are, but why should I care? Just because people are evil doesn't make them compelling by default. Everything I talked about with Zed, well, I stretched it out. He's such a paper-thin character. I recently made a video on Dying Light 2, and Waltz is such an apt comparison. In that game, he is a mustache-twirling villain, up until the very end, where he's just thrown a ton of character, and Zed is the same. He is just the guy in the background, the evil mob boss. But if we didn't see him in cutscenes prior to the end of the game, literally nothing would be different. It's not much different for his gang of Mobius either. The Mobius are the definition of mustache-twirling villains. They are selfish, cruel, and just all-around terrible people. Why? Who knows? They are just a bunch of assholes because reasons. There's this one Mobius named D. His backstory is that he was an Agnian that went crazy and murdered a bunch of people. And that's it. That's his character. No explanations or motivations, he is just crazy. It's worthless.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
And there are so many Mobius too. Every colony has a Mobius console that commands them. So every time we get to a new colony, it's like clockwork that you'll end up fighting another generic Mobius. I was critical of Torna in my video on the second game, but holy shit, they are leagues ahead of Mobius as villains. Even if it didn't make sense how certain things came together, they still fleshed out the members of Torna. You still knew what kind of people they were. It's a good thing the main cast has so much chemistry, or else it would be rough getting through this game. Uni is by far my favorite. Her constant sarcasm allows for some good levity without going too far where it takes me out of a scene. She is a good counterbalance to Tion's more serious and analytic approach to things, although Lanz and Senna also make a fantastic pair. Senna is always trying to gain the approval of those around her, so will often act differently depending on the situation. She can be a little self-conscious and unsure of her actions, while Lanz is the opposite. He is a knucklehead that may not be confident in certain moments, but feels that it would be a waste to do nothing, so prefers to charge in and ask questions later. He reminds me a lot of Ryan from the first game. They are both crazy strong physically though, so Lanz kind of makes up for Senna's lack of confidence, while she boosts his morale. It's quite endearing when the group first become Ouroboros, and they are grunting at each other while doing weird poses in an attempt to link up for more strength. Tion, baffled by the events, questions their motives, and it's a situation that comes across as so natural. There are highlights, great moments between characters, and intense themes that are fascinating to explore, but there's also so much wasted potential. I can see so much potential, and they dropped the ball. I want to like the story and world, but it's hard with so many problems. Luckily, the glue that holds this game together is their approach to gameplay. The way gameplay is handled is what I wanted out of combat from the second game. I feel it's a perfect example of how to innovate on design. Basically, they smashed both games together just like the world itself. Each character has a class with a total of 5 arts, or abilities, with 3 being equipped at once. The class also has a talent art that is built up by performing role-based actions, and it tends to do more what the role is oriented towards. Each class takes inspiration from its original world. Those from Keves recharge on standard cooldown timers, while those from Agnes recharge through auto attack hits. At first, the system seems extremely limited. Through Chapter 1, you are stuck to controlling Noah, and you only have 3 arts. So the start of the game is a massive slog. Fortunately, the system really begins to shine once we get into Chapter 2. In the previous 2 games, the party was limited to 3 active party members at a time. In this game though, all 6 party members are active at once and all participate in battle. This makes battles far more chaotic, but also far more of a spectacle as well. There's usually so much going on with so many animations, it can be difficult to keep track of what's specifically happening, but also makes it feel like a real battle between groups of people. What stops it from being a rough time is that you can freely swap control between any character at basically any time. Feel like the AI isn't doing a good enough job at a certain role, or your character gets stunned, just swap over to a different character and take charge. It allows for so much breathing room when going up against a tougher encounter. Sometimes in previous games, if the AI was messing up, you'd have to either deal with it or lose a fight to restart and change things. Now you can just do it all on the fly. It feels like such an upgrade. You aren't able to just swap between playing characters, but you can swap between their classes as well. This is by far the best design decision they made in this game. Any character can be any class so long as they unlock it, which happens naturally by playing the classes. This allows for an unbelievable amount of customization. At first I didn't think much of it, but you pretty quickly start to unlock additional classes. These classes provide a variety of playstyles, and it's all interchangeable. There are no restrictions. Since anybody can unlock any class, the possible team combinations are staggering. It doesn't stop there either. The connection between the characters by becoming Ouroboros allows them to link their skills together. That means a class belonging to Keves can equip an additional art that belongs to Agnes, and vice versa. As a class is unlocked and leveled up, additional abilities will be added to the options of those additional arts. This opens up the customization even further to such an insane degree. It gives almost complete freedom to the player and offers such an immense amount of options that it could easily diversify playthroughs. I absolutely adore it and feel this is such a natural but also perfect evolution of the gameplay of the previous games. There is also interlinking to consider. The 3 pairs of the group are linked, so for example, Noah and Mio are a pair. They can interlink, which turns them into a big dude that has improved abilities based on who chose the interlink. These forms can't be killed, but have a heat gauge that dictates how long it can be used for, which will of course fill up from a variety of sources. It isn't my favorite part of the gameplay, the new forms are just bigger versions of arts, but it does add more to think about when forming team compositions. The classes are interchangeable, but the pairings aren't, so if both members of a pair are healers and they interlink, it may put a wrench in your plans. Since it can actually be a detrimental thing at times and requires some forward thinking, I feel it adequately adds some depth to the gameplay. The one thing I will criticize about the gameplay is something I also disliked about the second game as well: health bars. Once again, enemies have what feels like way too much life when on normal difficulty. It isn't as bad as the second game, but can still make some fights feel like a massive slog, especially Mobius fights. Mobius usually have an absurd amount of life, and even when over-leveled, the encounters can still take 10 or more minutes to beat. I feel it has a lot to do with the way chain attacks work in this game. I actually love the chain attack system in this game. It feels like a mini-game, a puzzle to solve to get the most out of it. Basically, every character is given an option to attack and use any regular art desired. Each action performed will provide points to a meter at the top of the screen that will enact a battle plan of sorts. Healing rolls cannot get the meter past 100%, but once you do get it past 100%, the plan goes into effect, which will provide some sort of benefit and assault the target. Every time a meter is filled, attacks will continue to do increasing percentages of damage. It's possible to deal insane amounts of damage through the chain attack system. Like I said, I actually like the way chain attacks work. I find it fun to aim to get as many points as possible to maximize the amount of damage done. But with how much damage can be done, I feel this is why health bars were increased so drastically. Yes, you do have a much bigger party dealing damage, but even so, sometimes even regular enemies can take a chunk of time to beat. I think the chain attack system made the developers feel they needed to compensate by increasing overall health pools. It's unfortunate, not just because the bigger health pools mean you'll take longer defeating enemies, but chain attacks can also take a while as well. Every single ability and the planned attacks have to go through their full animations. It can eat up a decent chunk of time after so many attacks. At the end of the day, this is a minor criticism though, because even if it takes a while, it's still really fun for me to engage in the gameplay. My biggest gripe with the second game's combat was how overly and unnecessarily complicated it was. But they went back to a far simpler approach, and I believe it was for the best. Not only is it much easier to engage in the gameplay because there aren't as many systems bogging you down, but it completely opens it up to let the player have borderline complete customization. No more unlocking blades through random slot machine core crystals. Instead, new classes are acquired through quest lines. Quest lines that focus on a new character and tell a story. Some of these hero quests could be quite interesting too. For example, there is one where you run into a Mobius named Triton. He's a sailor, and unlike other consuls, he goes on adventures with his colony. When the group encounter him, he invites them to sit down and eat. He even challenges them to a competition. They do get into a scrap, but he remarks he's been alive so long he forgot how to use his Mobius powers. He doesn't have any interest in all of the stuff the rest of the Mobius do, and just wants to explore the world. Triton ends up joining the group, and he gives access to a very unique class that steals its abilities from powerful enemies, letting you build the class in any way you want. While I didn't do that myself, mainly because I couldn't be asked to go back and redefeat old enemies, it was a unique thing to run into while exploring the world. Hero quests really aided in immersing me further into this beautiful world. But new quests aren't the only thing to find out in the world of Ionios. Initially, the world felt very tiny as I followed the main quests. But at a certain point, that changed, and I realized the world was so much more massive than I thought. Exploration is incredibly rewarding. There are tons of little objectives to get all over. They aren't like major objectives like completing some dungeon or something, but instead like item containers that will drop some potential good stuff for you. You can also find soldier husks scattered all over the world. Noah and Mio are Offseers and play a flute to send off those that have passed. Gameplay wise, this will provide you with some affinity for the local colony, which could unlock more quests and such. What I really like about it though, is more from the story perspective. I find it endearing that they want to pay their respects to their fellow soldiers. It's their way of giving a funeral of sorts. It's a tiny thing, but adds a lot of flavor to the world, especially as you wonder what might have happened and how they might have ended up there. Oh, and really quick, can I just say, fucking thank you developers for putting item orbs back on the ground. It was one of the most annoying and painful parts of the second game, being required to go to a specific spot to get a big pop-up and have your blades say their voice lines, and then have all the items go flying everywhere. It's just so nice going back to just picking them up as we walk. I still don't like that enemies drop items on the ground instead of a chest, but at least they don't go flying anymore either. While I believe it's quite engaging to explore, the most disappointing thing for me was how underutilized the worlds themselves were. By that, I mean the Bionis and Allrest. Ionios is a mashup of both, but outside of us recognizing areas, there isn't really anything of substance. You can find parts of the fallen arm, and you can reach one of its fingertips, but it's more or less just traversable terrain. There's nothing more to it. Uriah is referred to as a mountain range, and there's a huge mine in it, but virtually nothing left that we knew. At one point, you can see the rubble of Fontsamaima, which amounts to a couple of buildings, and the stairs to where Mithra awakens in the game. It's kind of lame. I understand these people know nothing about these respective worlds, but that doesn't mean their histories have to be completely forgotten or ignored. It would have been cool to see the cast learn a little bit of history about where they came from by exploring certain areas like this. Perhaps seeing some sort of preserved writings of the Aegis War or something. I mean, they literally have people living inside of the Mechonis sword, and you are telling me nobody asked any questions? Like, I don't know, why there is a giant fucking sword sticking out of the ground? Or maybe what kind of creature could have wielded that? Which would have led some speculation, considering the picture of the Bionis and Mechonis fighting are still in Alchemoth, or even in Erethia Sea. It's just fucking Aerith Sea with some stuff from Lotharia scattered around. Like, nothing High Entia related. The tomb isn't there, or any sort of old facility or anything. It's just, I don't know, just something would have been nice. I thought they would have made more use out of it is all. The same goes for Annihilation events. In as early as the opening cutscene of the game, we see these events, where areas are, well, annihilated. They just get deleted from existence seemingly. Very little is explained about them, but they lead to unique environments. Areas can seem to be floating in mid-air. You can tell where they were originally attached, but the event broke pieces of it off. Oddly, the pieces act like the whole thing is still there and don't fall. When I first saw places like this, I of course thought this would absolutely lend to the exploration in some way. Getting to places that wouldn't normally be accessible because holes are created, or pathways are formed. But no. It barely even shows up in the game at all. I mean, the bad guys made cannons that shoot Annihilation events, which is hilarious, but it's sad that it's so underutilized. I think that's a great way to summarize the game. The game does have a phenomenal gameplay loop that truly innovates on the design of what came before. It provides an incredible amount of customization and freedom. It takes the beautiful scenery of both games and makes a brand new, gorgeous vistas that can leave you in awe. Its themes are far deeper than previous titles and explores intense concepts. The main cast is likable and has great chemistry. The story and game overall are quite immersive, while giving just the right amount of fan service without being too overbearing. The game gets so much right, but at the same time, the game doesn't utilize its characters to full effect, often missing otherwise fantastic opportunities to expand character and explore the themes. It wastes an immense amount of time with overly specific tutorials and overly long cutscenes. The majority of the antagonists, including their leader, are hollow shells barely fit to be called characters to begin with. There are so many reused flashbacks it can become frustrating. and very little of the story of the world is used from previous games. There is so much potential, so many opportunities, but it was so underutilized. There is a lot to love about the game. You can easily put in over 100 hours to this game and still have content to engage in. And that isn't including the DLC, Future Redeemed. I didn't talk about it at all because I'd rather dedicate a video just to it. There's a lot to talk about in there, but it deserves its own time to shine. But with this game, there's also a lot of awful things in the game that do drag down its overall quality. I do think it's worth the experience though, especially if you've played the previous titles. I just can't help but see the missed potential, and it feels terrible knowing how legendary the game could have been. That will be it for this video though. Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.